The last video was entitled Preparing for Mass Murder, 1876-77. This one is entitled Committing Mass Murder, 1876-77. We saw in the previous video the intersection of railroad violence and violence against Native American people, which could be reported in the same newspaper. We talked about, hypothetically, what columns 1 and 2 would look like in a big, thick print newspaper like the New York Herald Tribune. Let's move over a couple columns and come to the election of 1876. Okay, we are filming right now just as the Republican Party is about to hold its sort of convention. And we all know about what happened in the last election. The last presidential election we had, the Democratic candidate won by 3 million votes, but the Republican candidate took office because of the Electoral College. You understand that we do not live in a direct democracy, but instead we apportion Electoral College votes depending on the size of our state. And so you can win enough electoral delegates and still lose the general election. That's happened many times in American history. We are not a direct democracy. Well, in 1876, we had such an election. The contestants were, for the Democratic Party, a guy by the name of Samuel J. Tilden, who was from New York, and you don't remember him. And the Republican candidate was somebody you also don't remember, but you probably heard about him as president. His name is Rutherford B. Hayes. Black people are still voting in the South. This is Reconstruction. 1876 is when all that black activity is still going on. The way that Reconstruction worked to protect all that was that federal troops were stationed in the South to keep domestic order so that white tyranny would not overwhelm the black vote. You needed to have the black vote, if you were the Republican Party, in order to be able to ensure that you had a competitive place in the election. And of course, Southern voters who were black and Northern voters who were black were automatically enrolled in the Republican Party because that was the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and so forth and so on. So black voting in 1876 is really, really, really important. Just the same way right now we are talking about the question of black voting showing up or not showing up to determine whether Joe Biden will be able to occupy the office instead of Donald Trump. The black vote in American history has always been extremely important, either to have it or to suppress it. In this election, it's on. By the time the election is over, it's going to be off. The election takes place, the votes are counted, and the Electoral College is all screwed up because 3 different states report different totals where, if you believe one total, it's Tilden Democrat delegates that are going to the Electoral College, but if you believe the other total, it's Rutherford B. Hayes. They're contested delegations. Do you understand what I'm saying? You're not clear on who won the election in that state. It's like Florida, back in the time that George Bush was running against Al Gore, and the Supreme Court had to intervene. Do you remember all that? I hope. Anyway, 3 different states send 2 pairs of contested delegates to the ratifying convention where they are supposed to elect who's president. Delegates pledged from the same state for Rutherford B. Hayes, same delegates, different delegates for Samuel J. Tilden. The suspense about the election goes on for months and months and months, and nobody knows what the outcome is. That's what the cartoon is about. How does it end? Rutherford B. Hayes finally wins the election. How? By making a promise as the Republican Party president that he will withdraw all those federal troops out of the South, and that the black voters who have been voting in this last election will no longer have federal protections, and they'll be on their own from now on. You see how the vote works and how now the gates are open to suppress that vote? So in the middle of Indian Wars, in the middle of railroad wars, you go to column 3, you come to the contested election, and that's all again about voters who are black and white and how much the master remains. Then, once that is an issue that's out there, we go to the next slide and we commit finally the mass murder. And there we are. We've moved from the election to another cartoon, which shows in the background the absolute destruction of an entire African American community in Hamburg, South Carolina in 1876-77. Why did this happen? Well, if you're reading the New York Herald Tribune, you understand that we have a crisis about Indians that is all tied up in questions of race, tied up with questions of labor that are all tied up with questions of race, an election that's all tied up with who's going to be president, that's resolved by dealing with questions of race. Black voters now in a position to be suppressed. Now we watch the suppression taking place. In Hamburg, African Americans are deeply involved in local politics with the idea of controlling their own town council, their own state legislature, their own militia. They are politically what Reconstruction's supposed to be about. There is no remaining master in Hamburg at this point, and African American politics runs the thing until it becomes clear to a guy by the name of Wade Hampton, he's the guy in the front of the picture there, who is going to become the governor of South Carolina very quickly, that he should get together a private army of his own, called themselves red shirts. They all wore red undershirts. They all armed themselves. They marched into Hamburg, which is right on the Savannah River, right on the other side of Georgia, and massacred as many people as they possibly could in as short a time as they possibly could. Why? With the idea of saying now we have carte blanche to make the law of gravity work the way that it ought to. The Hamburg massacre sits in the headlines in column 5. So read backward from column 5, massacring black people after we withdrawn the troops, during which time we were involved in railroad wars that have to do with interracial violence, and then finally we're massacring Native people altogether. That's a big year. What kind of a year are we in? We have the COVID virus. We have unemployment. We have structural racism. We have the collapse of our international position around the world. You can begin to appreciate, I think, what this year felt like for people going through it. You can begin, I think, to understand why the defensiveness and why the militarization of white people, which we're seeing around us right now, in opposition to the world that they expect to be governed by the law of gravity, slipping away from their control. Do we know more about our situation as a result of looking at 1876? I'd argue we clearly do. And we can also remember that at this time, the first political lessons as a free young woman living in Tennessee that Ida B. Wells is learning is by reading those headlines.